Canal Calm Mind.
When the Roman Empire fell, the known world plunged into silence. Broken roads, abandoned cities, and forgotten laws marked the beginning of the medieval era. The central power disappeared, and Europe fragmented into small kingdoms. The night of history began to fall slowly. Trade routes that once carried silk and spices now lay dormant, and communities turned inward, isolated and afraid. In this power vacuum, a new order was born. Warlords and kings carved out fiefdoms from the corpse of the empire, ruling through the sword. Feudalism arose, a brutal pact of protection for servitude. Life for the common person became a harsh cycle of toil, often ending violently and young. From the icy north, Viking longships brought fire and terror. From the eastern steppes, nomadic horsemen raided with impunity. Survival was the only gospel. Yet, even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of light remained. Hidden away in remote monasteries, monks became the keepers of the old world's flame. With patient hands, they copied the great works of philosophy and science, preserving the wisdom of ages on fragile parchment. Each stroke of the quill was an act of defiance against the chaos. These isolated cloisters became the secret guardians of civilization, waiting for a dawn that was still centuries away. Without emperors, survival became the absolute priority. The vast, interconnected world of Rome fractured into 1,000 isolated pieces. Germanic peoples, once held at bay by the legions, now flowed across the forgotten borders, occupying the former Roman lands. The Goths into Hispania, the Franks into Gaul, the Angles and Saxons into Britain. They were not just conquerors. They were the new masters of a broken world, raising their own halls amidst the ruins of villas and temples. In this vacuum of authority, violence was constant, a daily reality for all. Law was not written in books, but by the edge of a sword. Justice belonged to the strong. Disputes were settled in blood, and raids by rival warlords or foreign invaders were an ever-present threat. The sophisticated legal system of Rome was replaced by the simple, brutal arithmetic of force. To be unprotected was to be a victim. Life became nasty, brutish, and short. Out of this desperate need for safety, a new way of living was born, forged in the crucible of chaos: feudalism. It was a simple, harsh bargain. The common farmer, the serf, pledged his labor and his freedom to a local lord in exchange for protection from the endless violence. This lord, in turn, swore allegiance to a more powerful king, promising military service for the right to rule his lands. It was a pyramid of loyalty built on fear, a chain of obligation stretching from the dirt-poor peasant to the crowned warlord. It was not liberty, but in a world that had forgotten order, it was survival. In a world ruled by the sword, your neighbor was your rival. Every lord with a fortress was a king in his own small kingdom, and the borders were drawn and redrawn in blood. Trust was a currency more valuable and far rarer than gold. Lords like Alaric the wolf and Borin the bear watched each other from their towers, locked in a cold war of suspicion, each waiting for the other to show a moment of weakness. But sometimes the wolf at your door was less dangerous than the dragon on the horizon. When the Viking longships snaked their way up the rivers, they did not distinguish between wolf and bear. Their fire burned any village. Their axes killed any soldier. A common threat demanded a common defense, even among the bitterest of enemies. And so, in secret clearings, under the cover of night, enemies would meet. Alliances were forged not in trust, but in shared fear. Oaths were sworn, not out of honor, but out of necessity. For a season, The wolf and the bear would hunt together. They would march as one, their combined forces a bulwark against the storm. In the heat of battle, rivals became allies, their shared purpose eclipsing their hatred for a single, desperate moment. They would stand victorious on the field, having pushed back the tide of chaos. But once the dragon was slain and the invaders driven back to the sea, the wolves would look at each other once more. The alliance had served its purpose. The shared danger was gone, but the ambition remained. For in the game of lords, peace is never a final state. It is just a pause in the war. Far from the halls of kings and the clashing steel of knights lived the vast, silent majority. For them, the world was not a map of contending kingdoms, but the simple, brutal outline of the fief where they were born. Most of the population lived and died without ever venturing beyond the river or the forest that marked the edge of their lord's domain. Their existence was bound to the soil, not by ownership, but by unbreakable obligation. Their universe was the field they plowed, the hut they slept in, and the sky under which they toiled. Their minds could not conceive of a world beyond it. Life was a cycle, dictated not by choice, but by the sun and the seasons. They worked from the first light of dawn to the last embers of dusk every single day. Their bodies were tools, strained and bent by the unceasing effort of plowing, sowing, reaping, and threshing. There was no rest, for the survival of their family and the wealth of their lord depended entirely on their labor. Summer brought the sweat, and the winter brought the biting cold and the gnawing dark. The work, however, remained the one relentless constant, and with every turn of this wheel, they faced the specters of misery. Famine was a constant companion. A single failed harvest, a single drought or flood meant starvation. Disease, for which they had no name and no cure, swept through their crowded, unsanitary huts, taking children and adults with a cruel indifference. And above all, there were the taxes. The Lord demanded his share. The church demanded its tithe. They gave what they could barely spare, leaving themselves with almost nothing to survive the long, lean winters. They were powerless to refuse, for to do so meant the whip, the stocks, or expulsion into a world where a lone peasant would not survive a day. In this life of profound and unending suffering, hope was a dangerous luxury. Where could it possibly be found? They found it in faith. The small, cold village church was their only refuge, a place where their earthly pain was acknowledged and a heavenly reward was promised. Faith was the only solace, the belief that their life of servitude was a mortal trial, and that true freedom awaited them in paradise. It was this promise of a better world beyond the grave that gave them the strength to endure the crushing hardship of their world on earth. As kings and emperors fell, as their castles crumbled and their dynasties turned to dust, a new power rose from the ashes. It did not command legions of soldiers or fleets of ships. Its weapon was faith. Its soldiers wore robes. While secular authority shattered into 1,000 competing fiefdoms, the church grew. It was the only institution that remained whole, its structure rigid, its purpose clear. It offered a sense of unity in a fractured world. It was becoming the new, invisible empire of the West. In an age of violence and ignorance, the monasteries became the last bastions of civilization. Hidden away in remote valleys or perched on wind-swept coasts, these communities of devotion became centers of learning. Here, while lords waged their petty wars, scribe monks waged a different battle against time and forgetfulness. In the quiet of the scriptorium, they painstakingly copied the words of the Bible, the philosophy of the Greeks, and the histories of Rome. They preserved the light of knowledge through a long, dark night, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would not be lost forever. For the common person, the Church was an ever-present force, its influence reaching into every corner of their brief, harsh lives. The village priest spoke of eternal salvation, a paradise of endless bliss that awaited the faithful. It was a promise of unimaginable comfort in a world of constant pain. But with the promise of heaven came the terrifying threat of hell. Sermons painted vivid, horrifying pictures of eternal damnation, of lakes of fire and unspeakable torment reserved for sinners. This fear was a powerful tool. It shaped behavior. It enforced morality. It ensured obedience. The Church taught that God was omniscient, His gaze penetrating every wall and every heart. But it was the Church on earth that acted as His eyes and ears. Through the sacrament of confession, it learned the deepest secrets of its flock, from the lowest peasant to the highest king. Its authority was absolute because its dominion was the human soul. It held the keys to heaven and hell, and in a world defined by suffering and uncertainty, that was the only power that truly mattered. The stone cathedrals rising across Europe were more than houses of worship. They were statements of dominance, monuments to an institution that had inherited the earth.
In the Middle Ages, the world was not seen as safe or predictable. It was a place filled with invisible forces, divine judgment, and ancient terrors lurking beyond the horizon. People believed sickness was sent by demons, that storms were signs of God's anger, and that the night belonged to creatures unseen. Every sound in the dark carried meaning. Every shadow could be a warning. This was not mere superstition, it was a reality etched onto the landscape. Famine would sweep across the land, turning fields to dust and neighbor against neighbor. War was a constant specter, a bloody harvest of men that left villages in ashes and women widowed. And then came the Great Plague, a shadow that fell across the continent, taking the pious and the sinner alike, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. In the face of such overwhelming death, people saw not random chance but the clear and terrible hand of God's judgment. Against this tide of uncertainty, there was but one fortress, the Church. Its stone walls were a promise of sanctuary, its bells a voice that broke the suffocating quiet. The priest was the intermediary between the mortal and the divine, his words holding the power to absolve sin or to condemn a soul to eternal fire. Saints were not distant figures, they were powerful allies, their relics holding tangible power to heal the sick or protect a village. Pilgrimages were grueling journeys undertaken not for leisure, but as desperate acts of penance and hope. Every soul carried the weight of eternity. The concepts of heaven, hell, and purgatory were not philosophical ideas. They were destinations as real as Rome or Jerusalem. Life on earth was a fleeting trial, a test of faith in a world designed to break it. To sin was to invite damnation, a real and visceral horror depicted in the art that adorned church walls, a constant reminder of the stakes. To die without confession was a terror beyond all others. Life was short, brutal, and deeply spiritual. Faith was not a choice, it was survival. Customs governed every moment of existence. From birth to death, nothing happened without ritual. To live was to obey traditions shaped by fear, belief, and the ever-present shadow of the world beyond. Part 2. The Peasants. Life bound to the earth. Most medieval people were peasants tied to the land they worked. They rose with the sun and slept when darkness fell. Their customs were ancient. Fields were blessed before planting. Seeds were sown only on specific days believed to be favored by God. Many believed the earth itself was alive. Legends spoke of spirits dwelling in forests and fields. guardians of nature who punished greed and disrespect. Before harvest, prayers were whispered. After harvest, offerings were left behind. The land gave life, but it could also take it away. This bond with the earth was one of both sustenance and terror. Every shadow held a potential threat, every unexplained event a sign. Fear was a constant companion, etched into their faces as deeply as the furrows in their fields. They saw the hand of God in the sun and rain, but they saw the work of darker things in a failed crop, a sick child, or a sudden storm. In the dim light of their huts, huddled around a meager fire, they shared stories. Tales not for entertainment, but for survival. They warned their children of Jenny Greenteeth, a river hag who pulled the unwary into a watery grave. They spoke of changelings, sickly fairy imitations left in the place of a stolen human baby, a whispered explanation for a child who failed to thrive. To ward off evil, a horseshoe was nailed above the door. Spilling salt was a terrible omen, inviting the devil into your home unless a pinch was thrown over the left shoulder, into the face of the waiting demon. The wilderness was not empty. At night, travelers feared the will-o'-the-wisp, a phantom light that danced over swamps, luring them to their doom. On stormy nights, they would hear the baying of hounds and the thundering of hooves in the sky. The wild hunt, a ghostly procession that foretold war, plague, or the death of someone who witnessed it. They believed in werewolves, men cursed to take the form of a wolf, their humanity lost to a primal hunger. An attack on livestock was not always a simple wolf, but perhaps a neighbor living a secret, monstrous life. And it was not only the wilderness that held its ghosts. The stone castles of the lords, looming over their fields, held their own sorrows. Whispers circulated of the Grey Lady of Stonecroft, the ghost of a nobleman's wife, betrayed and left to waste away in a high tower. They said she could be seen on moonless nights, a silent, drifting shape on the battlements, her face a mask of eternal grief. For the peasants, she was a tale of the world above them, a symbol of the great untouchable tragedies of their masters. The castle was a place of power, but at night it was just another haunted place to be shunned. Even the harvest was steeped in superstition. The last sheaf of corn was often woven into a doll, the corn dolly, to house the spirit of the grain through the winter, ensuring it would return in the spring. They lived in a world where the sacred and the profane were inseparable. The priest might condemn their beliefs as pagan, but to the peasant, they were just another layer of protection, another prayer whispered into the wind against the encroaching darkness. For them, the world was a complex tapestry of spirits, demons, and ancient powers, where survival depended on appeasing them all.
In lands carved by shadow and fear, the castles rose. They were not homes, but monuments to power. Stone beasts hunched over the domain of mortals. Their walls were thick with silence. Their gates were jaws of iron, and within them, time itself seemed to curdle and slow. Inside them lived nobles, prisoners of a gilded cage. They were bound by rigid customs and silent rules, a language of power spoken not in words, but in whispers and shadows. Every day was a performance on a stage of cold stone. Every gesture had meaning. Every silence was a proclamation. Where one sat at the table was not a matter of comfort, but a map of power and influence. What one wore was a banner, declaring loyalty, defiance, or a rebellion yet to bloom. A glance held the weight of a sword. But these walls held more than living secrets. Legends haunted them. Clinging to the stone like ivy, stories of betrayed lords whose final curses echoed on the wind, of poisoned kings who still wandered their chambers, searching for justice. Restless spirits filled the halls, their sorrow a permanent chill in the air. Fear was a constant companion. Many nobles slept beside relics in Holy Obzisa, Saint's Finger, a splinter of a sacred tree knot. Out of piety, but terror, they believed betrayal was a plague that left spiritual scars on stone and soul alike, a stain that could never be truly washed away. And so, power was a fragile, haunted thing, maintained by ritual, threatened by ghosts, and ultimately consumed by the very walls meant to protect it. The castle stood, silent witnesses to the slow, inevitable decay of the souls within. The castles rose on cursed ground, their foundations sealed with blood sacrifice. A myth known as the Hungry Stone claimed each fortress required a soul to anchor its walls, a spirit that would forever become the castle's first and most powerful guardian and prisoner. The stone itself became a conduit, forever yearning for the warmth of the living. The rigid customs were not for decorum, but for survival. Every rule was a pact with the dead. The finest chair was left for the First Lord's shade, lest he join the feast and drain the life from the head of the house. Spilled wine was an invitation for the weeping orphan, a spirit drawn to waste and sorrow, whose tears were said to cause immediate rot and decay. Every choice was a ward or a weapon. A certain shade of blue was worn to repel the red-handed maiden, the ghost of a spurned lover who clawed at the faces of those in rival colors. A direct gaze was a dangerous tool, for it could bind a lesser spirita glimmerman to the one being watched, an invisible tormentor that would whisper doubts and fears into their ear until madness took hold. The legends were specific, and their actors were eternal. Every family knew of Largi Vala, who was walled up alive and whose spirit now tests the mortar each night, searching for a single weakness to bring the entire castle down. In the throne room, the ghost of the poisoned king reenacts his demise at every sunset, a silent, agonizing play that served as a constant warning. Their faith was not in gods, but in countermeasures. Relics were not for salvation, but for defense against specific entities. Iron nails from a hangman's scaffold were used to pin shadow stalkers to their place. Mirrors were polished with salt and silver to trap whispering reflections, echoes of one's own self that could step out of the glass to take your place. They believed betrayal was a spectral infection, and they armed themselves against the souls of the dead. In the end, the stones always won. The castle, gorged on centuries of sorrow and fear, began to consume its inhabitants. Power was not a prize, but bait. The nobles were merely shepherds for a flock of ghosts, their lives, the final offering to the insatiable living entity of the castle itself.
In the age of iron and earth, one power ruled over all, not the crown, but the cross. The church was the skeleton upon which medieval life was built. Time itself was not measured by the sun, but by the tolling of bells. Each ring a summons, a warning, a reminder of the eternal. People did not fear the finality of death. They feared the eternity that came after. Sin was the great plague of the soul, a stain that could condemn a king as surely as a beggar. Confession was not for comfort, but a desperate surgery of the spirit. Fasting, pilgrimage, penance, ... These were the daily customs, the currency paid to ward off a damnation that was all too real. The chronicles of faith spoke of specific horrors. They told of Brother Gregor, whose sacred duty was to copy the word of God. Yet each dawn he found his work corrupted. He stood watch and saw it. A demon born of his own inkwell, a creature of shadow and stain. It did not threaten him with fire, but with knowledge, whispering forbidden secrets of creation and tempting him to allow one drop of its poison, one perfect lie, to be immortalized in Holy Writ. Salvation was the ultimate goal, a distant shore in an ocean of terror. It was a promise whispered from the pulpit, a vision of light at the end of a life of shadow, but the path was narrow, and a single misstep could send a soul plunging into the abyss. Every prayer was a gamble, every sacrament a fragile shield. The holiest were the most haunted. They spoke of the confessor's echo, a fiend that tormented priests. It would record these sins they absolved, and in the solitude of night, whispered them back, not as accusations, but as temptations. "You forgave this sin," the demon would hiss. "But did you truly understand it? Feel the greed dot, taste the wrath. Only then is the absolution pure." It sought to break a man's soul with the weight of the forgiveness he had granted. And so, every moment was lived under the weight of an unseen judge. Damnation was not a distant threat, but a constant presence, lurking in the rustle of leaves, in the heart of a neighbor, in the depths of one's own weary soul. Always near, always waiting.
There are places so fundamentally wrong they curdle the divine. The monastery of St. Jude of the Ash was one, built to reclaim a pagan wound in the earth. The stones were consecrated with prayer, but the ground never forgot its old gods. The monks came to pray for the lost, never realizing they were already among them. The infestation did not begin with screams, but with decay. It started in the kitchens, a demon of gluttony and waste. The bread molded before it could be eaten. The wine soured in its cask. Monks began to feel a gnawing hunger that no food could satisfy, even as the larders rotted around them. They were starving in a house of plenty. Next came the demon of pride, a whisper in the library's silence. It did not offer wealth, but intellect. It infested the holy books, twisting scripture into elegant, seductive heresies. It preyed on the learned, offering them visions of a greater truth, a more perfect understanding of God, one that placed them, the reader, at the center. Brother Mathis, the finest scribe, was its first victim. He stopped copying God's word and began to improve it. Then came the hollow men, demons of mimicry and paranoia. Monks would see their own reflections walk in the holes, going about their duties. These doubles would perform small, unsettling axmis, placing a prayer book, staring in silence, smiling without warmth. Trust crumbled that every brother saw a potential impostor in his brother, a demon wearing a familiar face. The monastery was no longer a house of God, but a gallery of damnation. The demon of gluttony starved them. The demon of pride drove them mad with blasphemy. And the demon of paranoia turned them against each other. Prayer became a scream. Faith became a memory. The abbot, the last two stands, did not pray for salvation before the end. They sealed the monastery, entombing the living and the dead, the monks and their demons. But such places are never truly closed. It remains a permanent scar on the land, a gateway that can be barred but never destroyed, a testament to the belief that hell is not a place you go to, but a place that can be invited in. The medieval mind did not distinguish between the world of flesh and the world of spirits. Magic was not fantasy. It was a fundamental law of nature, as real as mud and stone. They believed the veil to the invisible world was thin, and that things could, and often did, cross over. Most charms were for protection, but the same magic could be turned to malice. They believed a curse needed a vessel. A scorned lover might pay the cunning woman for a lead amulet, a cursed tablet, to be inscribed with the victim's name and a demon sigil. Buried where the victim must pass, it would leech their strength, bringing wasting sickness and misfortune that no priest could explain or cure. The old beliefs did not die. They merely went into hiding, beneath the veneer of Christian prayer. Paganism survived. Its rituals were woven into feast days, its gods renamed as saints, its magic hidden in plain sight. It was a silent rebellion of the soul, a refusal to completely forget the ancient spirits of the land. But if a curse could be made, it could be broken. This required a magic far more dangerous. You could not destroy a curse, only move it at a desolate crossroads. The cunning woman would perform the ritual of unbinding. This was not prayer. It was spiritual surgery, using a lock of hair to link the ritual to the victim. She would lure the affliction into a new Vesalian animal's heart. It was a transfer of suffering, a dark negotiation. To do this was to announce oneself to the shadows, to handle damnation itself. In this world of fear, an accusation was a weapon. The proof of a successful ritual was also proof of guilt. To perform a cure that the church could not was to admit to trafficking with forbidden powers. The very act to save the life was twisted into evidence of a demonic pact, and the gratitude of those she saved would quickly sour into terror. And so the people were caught in a trap. To ignore magic was to invite danger from the invisible world. But to uzi it, Ivan Fujid, was to risk the torch and the rope. It was an unwinnable war, fought against shadows, where the greatest enemy was often the fear in one's own heart. In the medieval world, death was not a visitor. It was a resident. It sat at the dinner table and slept in the bed. A fever, a scratch from a rusty nail, a winter's chill were potential death sentences. Life was a fragile exception, and its end was never far away, a constant, quiet companion to every living soul. But then came a different kind of death. The great pestilence. It swept through villages, not like a wolf, but like a flood, leaving nothing behind. The plague was a merciless force that shattered the known world. It did not distinguish between peasant and lord. To hear the creak of the death cart in your street was to hear the sound of the apocalypse at your door. With death so close, ritual became a shield. Upon a death, mirrors were covered, for it was believed the reflective surface could trap the departing soul, or worse, show the face of the next to die. Coins were placed on the eyes, a pagan toll for a spectral ferryman, but also a practical measure to keep the dead from staring back. And vigils were held through the long, dark night, not just to mourn, but to ensure the soul departed properly, and that the body did not stir. For the greatest fear was not of the soul's journey to the next world, but of the body's refusal to stay in this world. Legends warned of revenants da, restless dead, those who died with a great sin on their soul, a burning grievance, or a violent end could be denied peace. They were said to claw their way from the grave, animated by a dark hunger. These were not ghosts. They were walking corpses, seeking what was denied to them in life. They did not just haunt, they tormented. The revenant would return to its family, bringing wasting sickness with its touch, whispering despair into the ears of the living, and drawing the very life force from those it once loved. It was a plague focused on a single house. There was only one cure for such an affliction. The village would gather its courage and perform a terrifying act of desecration. They would unearth the body, and if it was found unnaturally preserved, they would grant it a second, final death. The heart pierced, the head severed, the body committed to fire. Only then could the living be safe. Only then could the dead truly die. In the medieval world, death rarely arrived unannounced, but it sent messengers. A raven on the roof, a dog howling at midday. The ghostly tolling of a church bell, only you could hear these, were not superstitions, but letters of summons. The people watched for them, read them, and understood. Death was coming. It was a known, if dreaded, part of the natural order, an event that cast its shadow long before it arrived. This grim expectation was woven into the fabric of life, a constant reminder of mortality that was met, not with surprise, but with solemn preparation for the inevitable journey. But then came a different kind of death. The great pestilence. It swept through villages, not like a wolf, but like a flood, leaving nothing behind. The plague was a merciless force that shattered the known world. It did not distinguish between peasant and lord. The arrival of a ship was no longer a cause for celebration, but for dread. Its mooring ropes, a bridge for the scurrying harbingers of doom. Red crosses appeared on doors like fresh wounds, marking houses sealed by disease. To hear the creak of the death cart in your street was to hear the sound of the apocalypse at your door, a relentless sound that signaled the end of everything you knew. With death so constant, ritual became a shield. Inside the home, mirrors were covered, lest they trap the departing soul and prevent its journey onward. Coins were placed on the eyes, a final payment to the ferryman for passage to the afterlife. After the body was taken away, grief had its own symbols. Mourners wore black, an outward sign of an inward sorrow that was deep and pervasive, to create a space of enforced quiet for the grieving. Straw was laid thickly before the house to muffle the sounds of the world and the passing carts. These were not just customs. They were walls built against the chaos of loss, a desperate attempt to impose order on an overwhelmingly disordered world. For the greatest fear was not of the soul's journey, but of the body's refusal to stay. Legends warned of revenants, the restless, dead. Those who died violently, or with a great sin upon their soul, could be denied peace. Their passing was often preceded by particularly dark omens, and the fear was that they would not rest easy. They were set to claw their way from the grave, animated by a dark hunger, their return hinted at by the very same signs that foretold their initial passing. These malevolent spirits were a terror born from grief and a profound fear of the unknown. These were not ghosts. They were walking corpses, seeking what was denied to them in life. A revenant would return to its family, bringing a wasting sickness with its spectral touch, whispering despair into the ears of the living. It was a plague focused on a single house, a curse born from one of their own. The revenant would draw the very life force from those it once loved, its cold embrace a promise of slow, agonizing decline. Livestock would be found cold and bloodless in the fields, and the creature's face might appear at a window, its eyes burning with a cold light, a terrifying reminder of its presence. There was only one cure for such an affliction. They would unearth the body, and if it was found unnaturally preserved, bloated, and fresh, as if it had fed on the life of the living, they would grant it a second, final death. The heart pierced by a stake, the head severed from the body, the remains committed to fire. A grim-faced priest would lead the villagers in this ghastly but necessary task, their torches cutting through the night. Only then, with the corpse destroyed and the bonfire roaring against the black sky, could the living be safe. Only then could the dead truly die. In the medieval world, death rarely arrived unannounced. It sent messengers, and every villager knew how to read them. It might be a sound. 3 sharp knocks on the door in the dead of night, with no one there when you opened it. It could be a sudden silence, the old family clock, ticking reliably for decades, stopping without cause. But the worst was the corpse candle, a ghostly flame scene drifting from the graveyard to a house, a faint, flickering light hovering over a distant roof. The villagers knew that house was marked. Within the week, there would be a body to carry out. But then came a different kind of death. The Great Pestilence. It arrived on ships, carried by rats scurrying down mooring ropes. And it swept through villages, not like a wolf, but like a flood, leaving nothing behind. A stark red cross painted on a door became a new kind of omen, a warning to stay away. The plague was a merciless force that shattered the known world. An apocalypse that did not distinguish between peasant and lord. To hear the creak of the death cart in your street, its wheels rumbling over the cobblestones as it collected its grim harvest, was to hear the sound of the end times at your door. With death so constant, ritual became a shield against the overwhelming chaos. Inside the house of the deceased, mirrors were draped in black cloth, lest they trap the departing soul on its journey. Coins were placed on the eyes of the body laid out for its final rest, a final payment for the ferryman to the afterlife. Grief, too, had its own powerful symbols. Mourners wore simple black armbands or dark, unadorned clothing, an outward sign of an inward sorrow that was now a part of daily life. Straw was laid thick on the street before the house to muffle the sounds of the world, quieting the rattle of passing carts and creating a space of enforced silence for the grieving. These were not just customs. They were walls built against a relentless onslaught of loss. Yet, for all the fear of plague, the greatest terror was not of the soul's journey, but of the body's refusal to stay. Legends whispered of Revenansta, restless dead. It was believed that those who died violently with a great sin on their soul, or whose passing was marked by a powerful omen like the corpse candle, could be denied their eternal peace. They were said to claw their way from the grave, their bodies unnaturally preserved, animated by a dark and terrible hunger. A shadow detaching itself from the tree line of a graveyard at twilight, moving with an unnatural gait toward the village lights, was a sight more terrifying than any disease. These were not ghosts. They were walking corpses, corporeal, but with a deathly pallor, seeking what was denied to them in life. The revenant would return to its family, its cold touch bringing a wasting sickness, its whisper sowing despair in the ears of the living. It would stand over the beds of its sleeping kin, drawing the very life force from those it once loved, a plague focused on a single house. It might be seen at a window, its face pressed to the glass, its eyes burning with a cold light, or its presence would be known when livestock were found in the fields, cold and bloodless. There was only one cure for such an affliction, a grim ritual for a grim problem. Led by a priest, a group of grim-faced villagers would venture into the graveyard at night and exhume the suspected coffin. If they pried it open to find the body inside bloated and fresh, not decayed as it should be, their fears were confirmed. They had granted a second, final death. An axe would be raised, the heart pierced, the head severed, and the body committed to a great bonfire that roared against the black sky. Only then could the living be safe. Only then could the dead truly die.
In the heart of a siege, time is measured in heartbeats and crumbling stones. For 30 days, the walls of Oakhaven had held. For 30 nights, Sir Gideon had watched hope wither like a cut flower. Honor, he once believed, was a shield, but now it felt like a cage. His granaries were empty. His soldiers were specters of their former selves, and the faces of the children were hollowed by a hunger he could not fight with a sword. Honor provided no bread. It offered no warmth against the coming winter. It was a cold, silent God in a time of desperate prayer. Then from the deepest shadows of his doubt, a voice answered. It did not speak of courage or of glory, it spoke of solutions. The whisperer came as a promise, a shortcut through the slaughter. It offered him victory, absolute and bloodless, for his side at least. A poison subtle and swift, an act of such profound dishonor that it would save everyone he had sworn to protect. The choice was laid bare, a clean victory and a stained soul, or a noble defeat and a graveyard of the innocent. The very definition of his life's code was put on trial in the court of his own desperate mind. What is honor when it demands the sacrifice of the living? Is it a rigid, unthinking dogma, or is it the higher principle of preservation? He was haunted by the memory of his oath, the weight of the sword on his shoulders, the promise to be a beacon of justice, but he was equally haunted by the weeping of a mother who had just lost her child to fever. The whisperer's logic was a venom of its own, seeping into his resolve. A dead hero is of no use to anyone, it hissed. A living pragmatist can rebuild. Your honor is a luxury you can no longer afford. Standing on the cold battlements, the vial in his hand felt heavier than any shield. He looked down upon the enemy, upon the thousands of lives he could extinguish with one cowardly act, and in the flickering firelight of their camp, he did not see monsters. He saw men who followed a banner just as his did. That was the truth of it. To win this way was not to defeat an army, but to murder a sleeping city. He thought of the young squire who still looked at him with eyes full of belief. What would that boy become if his hero taught him that their most sacred vows were disposable? He realized his legacy would not be the fortress he defended, but the principles he refused to surrender. The choice when it came was not a choice at all. It was an affirmation. He would not buy his people's lives with the currency of his soul. He shattered the vial and with it the temptation of a hollow dawn. He would face the enemy, not with poison but with steel. He would offer his men not a guaranteed victory, but a meaningful end. Because a kingdom can be lost and retaken, a life can end, but an honor, once knowingly sacrificed, is a ghost that will haunt all the days you have stolen for yourself. And that was a price Sir Gideon would not pay. Life in the medieval world was a thing of rigid, brutal order. It was a life measured in seasons of back-breaking toil and governed by the unyielding authority of the Lord and the priest. Every day was a testament to hardship, a prayer for survival against famine and plague. The world was a precarious place, held together by strict hierarchies and the fear of God. But for a few stolen days a year, that order was not just broken, it was gleefully, terrifyingly shattered. For despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, medieval people celebrated with a ferocity that bordered on madness. These were the festivals of misrule, the carnivals of chaos. For a brief, intoxicating period, the world was turned upside down. The peasant became the king, the fool became the pope. Social order, the very bedrock of their existence, dissolved into a drunken pageant. The lord of misrule, chosen from the common folk, would preside over a court of delightful anarchy, his decrees mocking the very laws that chained them for the rest of the year. The sacred was made profane. Holy hymns were twisted into bawdy tavern songs. The solemnity of the church was invaded by the chaos of the street. It was a necessary release, a pressure valve for a society on the edge. But this freedom was a double-edged sword. It was a deeply held belief that during these times of upheaval, the veil between the worlds grew thin. The boundary separating the living from the dead, the human from the inhuman, became porous. While the villagers danced and drank, they knew they were not alone. Spirits, ancient and nameless things from the woods and the earth, were drawn to the chaos like moths to a flame. They watched from the edge of the firelight, their unseen eyes witnessing the revelry. Every laugh had to be tempered, every boast swallowed. The ancestors were listening. The Fae were waiting. And God, or the gods that came before him, were judging. And so joy and fear walked hand in hand through the muddy streets. The wild abandon of the dance was shadowed by the terror of what might be dancing alongside you. The laughter was a little too loud, a little too desperate, as if to ward off the encroaching silence of the woods. This was not simple celebration, it was a gamble. Excess, they believed, could draw misfortune. A boast too proud might invite a blight on your crops. A blasphemy too bold could earn divine punishment, or worse, attract the attention of something far older and less forgiving than the Christian God. Every moment of liberation was paid for with a moment of profound existential dread. They were celebrating on the edge of a cliff, keenly aware of the abyss below. In the medieval mind, the known world was a brittle island, surrounded by an ocean of the unknown. And on their maps, this fear was given a face. Cartography was not just a science, it was an act of cataloging terrors. Beyond the familiar coastlines and kingdoms, the parchment came alive with monsters. Sea serpents coiled in the vast empty oceans. Giants slumbered in uncharted mountains. Dragons with breath of fire and scales of iron guarded the world's edge. These were not mere decoration, they were warnings. They were a declaration that humanity's knowledge had reached its limit, and beyond lay a realm where logic died and nightmares were made real. But one did not need to sail to the edge of the world to find monsters. The unknown was not just a distant threat, it was a neighbor. Every forest was a borderland, a gateway to that other world. The familiar path could turn strange, the familiar trees could seem to watch. The woods were not just wood. They were a primordial realm, older than any kingdom, and they did not belong to man. Legends were the maps for these territories of the soul. They were whispered in taverns and told by the fireside, speaking of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the everyday. They spoke of werewolves not as distant beasts, but as the neighbor you've known your whole life, cursed by the moon to become a ravenous predator. They spoke of the fair folk, the beautiful and terrible fairies, who would steal a healthy human child from its cradle and leave a sickly, wizened changeling in its place, an explanation for illness and a manifestation of a parent's deepest fear. And they told cautionary tales of creatures that existed to punish human folly, the arrogant knight who entered the woods boasting of his prowess, only to be found as scattered bones, the greedy merchant who strayed from the path for a shortcut, never to be seen again. These stories taught a vital lesson. The world was full of ancient powers that did not tolerate pride. This constant pressing fear of the unknown shaped the customs of daily life. It bred a culture of profound caution. Before any journey, prayers were offered not just to God, but sometimes in a hushed whisper, to the old spirits of the road and the woods. Charms were carried, rituals observed. Humility was not just a virtue, it was a survival tactic. You walked quietly, you spoke little, you did not boast, for you never knew what was listening from behind the trees. Every trip beyond the village walls was an act of faith, a step into a world that was actively hostile, where monsters were real and the map had already told you so. In the medieval mind, the known world was a brittle island, surrounded by an ocean of the unknown. And on their maps, this fear was given a face. Cartography was not just a science, it was an act of cataloging terrors. Beyond the familiar coastlines and kingdoms, the parchment came alive with monsters. Sea serpents coiled in the vast empty oceans. Giants slumbered in uncharted mountains. Dragons with breath of fire and scales of iron guarded the world's edge. These were not mere decoration, they were warnings. They were a declaration that humanity's knowledge had reached its limit, and beyond lay a realm where logic died and nightmares were made real. But one did not need to sail to the edge of the world to find monsters. The unknown was not just a distant threat, it was a neighbor. Every forest was a borderland, a gateway to that other world. The familiar path could turn strange, the familiar trees could seem to watch. The woods were not just wood. They were a primordial realm older than any kingdom, and they did not belong to man. Legends were the maps for these territories of the soul. They were whispered in taverns and told by the fireside, speaking of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the everyday. They spoke of werewolves not as distant beasts, but as the neighbor you've known your whole life, cursed by the moon to become a ravenous predator. They spoke of the fair folk, the beautiful and terrible fairies who would steal a healthy human child from its cradle and leave a sickly, wizened changeling in its place, an explanation for illness and a manifestation of a parent's deepest fear. And they told cautionary tales of creatures that existed to punish human folly, the arrogant knight who entered the woods boasting of his prowess, only to be undone not by a physical monster, but by the forest's own illusions. His pride led him to fight a phantom, and his foolishness was his doom. This constant pressing fear of the unknown shaped the customs of daily life. It bred a culture of profound caution. Before any journey, prayers were offered not just to God, but sometimes in a hushed whisper, to the old spirits of the road and the woods. Charms were carried, rituals observed. Humility was not just a virtue, it was a survival tactic. You walked quietly, you spoke little, you did not boast, for you never knew what was listening from behind the trees. Every trip beyond the village walls was an act of faith, a step into a world that was actively hostile, where monsters were real and the map had already told you so.
The great clock of an age wound down. The Middle Ages, an era of iron and faith, of soaring cathedrals and shadowed forests, began its slow, inevitable fade into twilight. The clang of swords on shields grew distant, the grand castles began their long slumber into ruin, and the dust of centuries started to settle. But as the world of men changed, the world of shadows did not. The legends, born in firelight and whispered fears, refused to die. They simply changed their masks. Many customs, rituals that once held the power of life and death, bled into the modern world, their origins forgotten. They live on as simple superstitions, knocking on wood to ward off ill fortune, a faint echo of the belief in protective spirits dwelling in ancient trees. The shudder at a black cat crossing your path, a lingering remnant of the fear of witchcraft and familiar spirits. Spilling salt, a dread that harks back to a time when salt was life, and its waste an invitation to dark entities. These are the ghosts of old beliefs, clinging to the architecture of our daily lives, their chilling purpose now softened into habit. The grand festivals, too, survived the turning of the age. The bonfires of midsummer, once lit to honor pagan sun gods and repel dragons, continued to burn, now reframed within new calendars, their wild, primal energy hidden just beneath the surface of celebration. The masked parades of carnival, a final, frenzied burst of chaos before the solemnity of Lent, carry the DNA of ancient rites that blurred the line between the living and the dead, when for a single night the spirits walked freely among mortals. The old gods were not vanquished, they were merely renamed, their ancient power channeled into new traditions, their faces hidden behind a veneer of civility. But it is in our stories that the medieval soul finds its most enduring sanctuary. The tales told to children, sanitized and softened, were once grim warnings. The deep, dark woods of fairy tales were not metaphors. They were real places where wolves and witches lurked. The helpful sprites and wicked goblins were not fantasy. They were the unseen forces that governed the harvest, the health of livestock, the very fate of a village. Every creak of a floorboard in the dead of night, every shadow that flickers at the edge of sight, is a testament to this legacy. The era ended, its stone and steel returned to the earth, yet its shadows remain woven into our very being. In stories, in rituals, in the ancient unshakable fear that we are never truly alone, that the unseen is always watching,